know you heard me on the radio, flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K. I know you heard me on the radio, flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K.
Rutgers fans, Night Watch viewers, welcome to another episode of Night Watch. I'm your host, Larry K. It's a Monday morning. We're knee-deep into spring ball, and we got a lot of things to talk about. But since you love the content so much with Mr. David Anderson last time, we have more content for you. We're going to keep this rolling. This series with David Anderson is going to keep being brought to you by Night Watch regularly, and we are going to have part 2 of embracing the future of college athletics. But today, we're going to talk about something a little different since we are knee-deep into spring ball. Spring game is coming up. There's a couple moving parts. We've heard from Coach Schiano. We've heard from the staff throughout the spring. I ran out. I got my coffee. It's the same every morning, and I need it. And I got David Anderson back. We're going to talk about the realistic ceiling for Coach Schiano and for the Rutgers football program. But in order to know where you're going, you got to know where you've been. So this part 1 episode, we're going to be talking about Schiano 1.0, some of the things that, went well, didn't go well. The era, obviously a different world back then, but what lessons can we get from 1.0? How has maybe Schiano learned? How has the game evolved? And how does his successes and maybe shortcomings in 1.0 affect the overall ceiling that we may see now in 2.0? And David Anderson joins me. Welcome, sir. I know you've been doing a little tour. You did something with Aaron the other day. You're busy in life. You got a lot going on, but welcome. Thank you for making the time for our Night Watch listeners today. How you feeling, brother?
I'm doing all right. I hurt myself in a hockey game 2 weeks ago, so I'm still reeling from that one. But other than that, good to be here as the weather continues to warm up all throughout the East Coast. So
very nice. I was down in Atlantic City this weekend celebrating a birthday, playing a little golf at the Twisted Dune, gorgeous course out in the Pine Barrens. So I'm embracing the weather as well. You're still active playing hockey. That's more than I can say. So props to you, sir.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, let's jump into this. I mean, we're in spring ball. I mean, before we jump into Schiano 1.0, you don't have to get too much in the weeds, but just general, how you feeling right now about our program and about this upcoming season?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people say, you hate to say this because, in the NFL, Bill Parcells would always say you are what your record says you are. But college football is a different animal. It's less games. You've got teams on your schedule that you may really have no shot at, or you should really have no chance of losing. So there's less of those toss-up games, and it's entirely possible that this team will be better than it was last year, but their record might not be as good. I don't think you can go with that mindset, but it's entirely possible that will happen. I mean, it sounds like their offense is going to be better. Defense, I haven't heard negative things, but I think we might need to temper expectations because they just lost so many guys who know how to play football that were in the right spots or just maybe were a step slow at times, that it's going to be hard to, in one season, completely turn over practically the entire unit and expect to even be an average Big Ten unit on that side of the ball, even with Greg Schiano's coaching acumen.
Yeah, not to mention the change at the top on defense with the defensive coordinator losing a very good one, getting somebody who we've had in the past who, has obviously a ton of experience, has done great things at Rutgers and other aspects, but the last tenure as D coordinator didn't necessarily grow great. I mean, obviously you got Sparber in there trying to bring a different perspective as well, but he won't be calling the defense. But I understand it. I was actually driving the other day, listening to Schiano's presser, one of them, and just thinking about the fact that, I do love Rutgers football, and regardless of the fact, what the record might be, and regardless of the fact I was a little disappointed in some things last year, and we'll talk about that in part 2 of this series. I do just think part of college football is enjoying the games, winning the games you can win, and having some of those memories. Speaking of that, I don't know that Rutgers in my estimation, it's just being completely candid, and people could crucify me in the comments if you want. Leave a comment, argue with me. I don't think I'm ever going to see Rutgers, in the national title conversation, and I don't think we're really have a chance of going very deep in the college football playoff anytime, even remotely soon. That's just my general take, and it has nothing to do with the coach or anything else. I just think that's the reality of this program, this school, and I still enjoy it. I'm still a fan, and there's still a place for me to root for. But in that vein and in that spirit, let's talk about this. The actual ceiling of Rutgers football, it was looking a lot more bleak, I think, if you go back to, what was it, 2000, 2001, I believe. And Greg Schiano comes in. You tell me. It looks like my year might be
Yeah,
off.
so if I remember right, Greg Schiano's first year coaching was 2001.
Okay.
So the final year of the Terry Shea disaster, I believe, was 2000. Usually, I have Aaron to back me up on this because he was a student in that time.
Mm-hmm.
And 2000 was Terry Shea's fifth and final season. Rutgers went 3-8, 0-7 in the Big East, and was getting spanked regularly by Miami, Virginia Tech, even Pittsburgh, Syracuse, Boston College, never mind our old friends at West Virginia. So I believe in the Shea era, they only finished above seventh one time. And that was when they went 5-6 in 1998, where they were coming off of an 0-11 season. So optimism was kind of low, and I was really started watching Rutgers at the end of the Graber era. That was really when I could kind of follow it. My dad would always take me to the games, especially the season that Rutgers Stadium was under construction, and we went to a lot of games in the Meadowlands because Rutgers
Mm-hmm.
played their home games there that year. And so the idea was coming from Graber, who was a little bit like Schiano and like trying to rally New Jersey and making New Jersey kind of Rutgers, New Jersey's football team. If you remember the NJ Rutgers on the helmets, that Mike Broadbent likes
Yeah.
to wear the Colgate toothpaste style shirt. And it just didn't really pan out, the Graber era. And so Rutgers tried to go in the opposite direction by taking an outsider who was more of an offense-focused, passing-focused guy in Terry Shea, who proved before and after to be a decent NFL quarterbacks coach, but he just didn't get it. And so there was a lot of parallels to the Ash era where you're trying to put a square peg in a round hole and just not understanding. So when Rutgers went and brought in Schiano the first time, he was the defensive coordinator at Miami, who was really peaking the second time with some of possibly the most talented team ever assembled right around the turn of the century there when they won one title and then were basically robbed of another one, even though my Ohio State neighbor would disagree with that. And so right around that time, Schiano comes in, and for lack of a better term, the rip on him was that he had no personality, that he knew football. He was a tough guy. He was a Jersey guy, but he didn't really have a lot of personality. But there were some smart people around the program at that time who, for example, put him in that commercial with James Gandolfini
Yeah, I remember.
from, The Sopranos. And so there were some smart people around, and he did come in with a solid plan top to bottom. And so kind of the stench that existed from the Shea era of just that one season of somewhat hope that had completely been extinguished, there was a little bit of enthusiasm, but I think people were not that optimistic that someone could just come in and turn this around after they had seen like an experienced, for lack of a better term, power six coach and Dick Anderson, followed by Doug Graber, who was like the Jersey guy, brought some enthusiasm, got some big time commits early on, followed by the West Coast passing type guy. They'd kind of tried all different things in terms of their coaching hire, none of which were really working. And so I would say there wasn't a lot of optimism when Schiano came in, other than that people knew, hey, he's tough, he's going to battle, and we're going to get the best that this guy has to offer at that time. So that's kind of my recollection of what was happening there during the late 90s. But again, Aaron really would be better because he was a student at that time. But as a follower of the program, watching every game, that was kind of the feeling that I got when he arrived for his first stint as a head coach at Rutgers.
And I remember, that era. I actually sat with him at one time because a good friend of mine was being recruited. And it was prior to 2006. And he was saying, people around here love to come out to an event. They love a winner and watch. This thing's going to blow up bigger than you can imagine. It's going to be an actual thing. It's going to get traction. Even then, I had some skepticism, having grown up in New Jersey my entire life. When I did follow Rutgers, it wasn't very good. I started to kind of get enthusiastic when he came in, and I think part of that for New Jersey was the branding. The Block R. You started to see it on every car, and the just general goodwill and enthusiasm. Obviously, much of that happened after 2006, where the hype train happened and the season was memorable. But talk about, he comes in now. This program does not have a history of competing with major powers. Obviously had good seasons back in the 70s and whatnot, and a different, type of schedule. And obviously have a long history. He goes about it. It's a completely different world. What skills and assets from Schiano were applicable in that era that enabled him to take a program that was essentially a bottom feeder and build it up into, first a really formidable team. First, 05, you're starting to make those dents. Yeah. In 06, you have a really formidable season, which I know we celebrate it ad nauseum, but there's some things I'll talk about with 2006 in hindsight that you're like, if that's your high watermark, I mean. But then obviously we're a formidable team after that, perennial bowl contenders. Aside from a season or two that's rough, we are, respected college football team with some really good fan turnout, some good games, etc. What skills did he employ? What tactics in a different era, obviously, where you could develop and recruiting was heavily high school focused? What did he do to build that program from the ground up?
Yeah, well, like you said, the state pride really went a long way, I think, for recruiting and for fundraising. Like, this is, for lack of a better term, not the same old Rutgers, right? And that was one thing that continues on. I think he was a lot more detail oriented, especially than Shea. And there are times that matters more than others. Now is probably another one. And I do think that there was a real focus on development. And I don't know where he got that from, because, when you're getting, it wasn't probably at his Miami stop, because in Miami, guys show up and, you just basically have to get them to buy in, and they're an All-American in some cases. He probably got a lot of that, and I've never heard him talk about this at length, but I'm guessing he got that from Joe Paterno, because the biggest thing that I would remember from like a pure college football standpoint about that time was that Rutgers would just develop linebackers, and Penn State had been known as linebacker U for a while there. And linebacker is a position where, yeah, you can physically compete occasionally as a freshman. Like Rutgers did have DeVron Thompson, who was a huge 4-year starter, didn't play in the NFL, but he was a good player. And then after that, it would be 2 or 3 guys would go to the NFL, and then another guy would step in. Like, we got Kevin Malice to stepping in, and now he goes and plays in the NFL for years. Like, didn't see that one coming, and so there was a lot of that development. And the reason that I harp on the linebacker thing is because college football, especially at that time, was a place where if you had really good linebackers, they could really help your pass rush and really help you in coverage. The NFL had started to shift away to kind of isolating linebackers and trying to get them off the field because they were the best athletes on the defense. But the fact that Rutgers built their defense with strong linebacker play, and they were able to develop guys year after year after year after year as kind of the backbone of their defense, allowed them to stay as a defensive first team that was built from the middle out. And that allowed them to do things like play with some smaller pass rushers up front, or use some undersized defensive backs sometimes, or kind of by having 2 strong linebackers, your third guy might not be elite in either. Like, I think of Quinterio Frierson, right? Non-NFL player, kind of bigger and slower. But when you had other guys next to him who were so elite, it allowed you to do that. And so one thing that you see a lot of times in the NFL is it's not about having every position checkboxed. It's that you have a strength of your team and an identity of your team. And I think Rutgers really had that during his first tenure. And then all these other things kind of were spokes out of that. And that came from the ability to, recruit and develop players, especially at that spot. And then, then you get guys going to the NFL, then you get people believing in your program, and so on and so forth. So I think that a lot of those things tie into to that fact. And like I said, I think he took a little bit from every one of his stops, but that was one that wasn't something that you could only do at Miami. Much like we criticized Chris Ash, he tried to do exactly what they did at Ohio State. It doesn't work when you don't have 5-star players. Developing linebackers is something you can do, even if they're playing, let's say, a year earlier as a starter at Rutgers than they would be at an elite program. And so that is probably, if you want to say one thing that's kind of the center, that's probably what I would point to.
And when he's developing a defense like that, how much do you think, schematics played into that, i.e. he had a certain system and a scheme defensively that enabled him to, develop the players that were available to him? Was the scheme itself inherently innovative or, good? And then, what was it, that was it the chicken or the egg? Hey, I got these players that I can now develop the scheme around. Was the scheme inherently good? And now I could plug in different types of players to, enable me to go out and get the guys that'll actually come here to start and still have a good showing. I mean, talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. But what I think the key was having the personnel to do what you need to do. And so, again, I know I'm touching on a lot of errors here, but like basically in the Chris Ash defense, it will not work unless you have a strong side linebacker that's awesome. I mean, awesome. And he didn't have that at Rutgers, right? Like he had some pretty good guys that were okay, but what Schiano's defense relied on, especially because he was of that Miami mindset of like speed over size, in a sense, Rutgers was innovative in a lot of the stuff they do by playing strong side, weak side.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that allowed them to do, and you see, they got burned by this a little bit last year when they're trying to figure out which side is the strong side. So when you're playing defense, the first thing that the middle linebacker, whoever, everyone will call it out if you can identify which is the strength call, which is the strong side. So we, in my team in college, we called Larry for left, our left, or Ray for right. Now, really, that's just saying which side is the strong side. So we'd say Larry, 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 and then Now, we didn't switch the entire line like Rutgers does, but once you do that, you can basically limit so that not every defensive player needs to play every single role and do every single thing on that defense, right? So you can protect your guys, or in the case of Schiano defense, it allows you to play with a smaller weak side linebacker whose job is to just run around and make all kinds of havoc and plays. Now you saw this with Kasim Green when he became the Big East Defensive Player of the Year, was a 3rd-round draft pick by the Chicago Bears, and they had other guys who could do that. So if you and then from the defensive line standpoint, it also allows you to usually play with a lighter end because that guy is not necessarily going to be getting blown off the ball by a tight end and a tackle, right? Because especially at that time when it was more run heavy, if you have a lighter guy at defensive end who can't hold his ground, they're just going to double team him and blow a huge hole. And then that prevents your linebackers from even flowing into there, and it's like a guaranteed, let's say, 4-yard gain, maybe more. And so the strong side, weak side thing on defense was very innovative. They were also a little bit innovative on offense, and I think the credit for that one goes to Craig Versteeg, because Rutgers was one of the first teams that did a lot of that shifting on offense, and it wasn't new. I mean, if you watch movies from football in the NFL in the 70s, like with the Dallas Cowboys and North Dallas 40 and all that stuff, that wasn't new. But offensively, they kind of did the same thing. They would kind of move guys around right before the snap, and so defenses, they could basically force a defense to not be ready for what they were about to do. And all that motion kind of protected the backs, because just like the Dallas Cowboys under Tom Landry did the same thing, that led you to use shorter running backs, and then everyone's all worried about where the tight ends are moving. You got this back and you can't even see him, or you see him, but it's at the last moment. So there was some innovation, but I would say it was the combination of the innovation and what players you could get that fit your scheme that could, be better in that scheme than they would be elsewhere, where you were getting that competitive advantage. And so then when success breeds success, and Aaron always harps on that the vision for a new coach is a short window, and you have to show results. So just like we saw in basketball with Peichel, right? He showed results quickly enough, like that Madison Square Garden run in the Big Ten tournament was to show enough for people to start
Right.
believing. And then the money comes in, more players come in, you just have general enthusiasm. Your players feel more confident that things are moving up. And so I think that, Schiano was able to do that. It wasn't perfectly linear in his first stint. I think 2004 was a step back from 03 record wise, but to me that was really where it was.
So then he started to build that up, and obviously we get to the point where he assembles quite the team, in that mid 2000s, and we get '05, and then we go over the top. Some would say in 2006. Talk about that level of success, whether it was clearly at the time it was mind blowing, and to this day,
Shocking.
it's seen as the
Yeah.
high watermark, the pinnacle of success at Rutgers, which it essentially is. But talk about it. Talk about the culmination of it going into that year, and then the aftermath, where we are a perennial bowl contender and a perennial bowl team. Kind of up into there. At that point, I think we are now well aware in this fan base that there became warring factions in the fan base a few years after 2006, right? Where
Yeah.
it was unquestionable in 2006 that Greg Schiano was, and I'm not even saying he's not the best Rutgers is going to do it or anything like that, but there was warring factions a few years after that when Rutgers failed to reach that level really again, and when they failed to circumvent, get over that level really ever. There was a lot of warring factions that, hey, we got to this level, but we need to get further ahead. And, I don't know if it's game day or this or that. We had the great recruiting class, 2012. Schiano leaves. But just talk, don't go all the way into the leaves thing. I'll fill in some questions. But go into that 05, 06, really 06 success, and then being a perennial bowl contender. What were the reasons that worked, and why did it not ever get beyond that at that time?
I think there's a
Even that
couple
season,
main
we lose 2 games.
yeah,
I mean,
I think there's a couple main factors for this one. One, so if for anyone who remembers the Cincinnati game, and I know you said don't get in the weeds, but basically Cincinnati was a team Rutgers had a lot of trouble with, and
Mhm.
ultimately UConn as well. And these were not teams that were like the top. But the reason for that is because their coaches figured out how to take advantage of Rutgers' smaller defensive line. So I think that part of it was scheme. Part of it was teams figured out how to play against this. And one of the ways to do it was if you have taller linemen, you kind of don't let Rutgers get inside you. You don't let them engage you. And so teams like Cincinnati would kind of keep their taller linemen, and they were able to kind of keep Rutgers at bay. And so
Mhm.
you can overcome that with emotion and energy a little bit, like Rutgers did in the '06 win against Louisville. But schematically, that's not going to last forever, right? So
Yeah.
that was one thing. Another thing is just the knocks on Schiano as a game day coach, and he talks about how like games can take on a person out of their own, and that's true because it's kind of like the person who's always prepared, and then if something goes against and they're not ready for it, they don't know how to react, right? Like I always talk about with people just in my personal life that most personality traits have positives situations that they're and negatives, right? So maybe you're a person who loses stuff all the time. You lose like your car keys and you're like whatever, whereas the person who never loses their car keys is pissed off about it for a week when it happens, right? So
Yes.
it's still usually better to not be a person who loses stuff, but there are instances where it manifests itself. So I think this is kind of like a pick your poison type thing. Now, the people you were talking about that were saying Shadow's only getting us here, we're kind of, I think, looking at like, hey, the novelty is starting to wear off, both in scheme and personnel. And then also, when you look back at it, college football was evolving in the opposite direction with the pass and a run game. Rutgers was trying to double down because now they thought they had the linemen and they didn't have to pass as much. Whereas one of my biggest criticisms that I really didn't think Shannon would get back to this spot like they did the last 2 years was because to get there the first tenure, they had to chuck the ball around. Like Ryan
Mhm.
Hart led the Big East in interceptions a few times. And
Yeah.
so Rutgers then kind of closed ranks and became a running team in a sense. And then ultimately that worked for them to steamroll any team that was lesser than them, or if they won the turnover battle, they would win against equal teams. but it made it more difficult for them to beat a superior opponent.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they made a couple upsets, like they beat South Florida, Louisville, but these teams were not, and we even knew at the time, these are not the depth and power of like a top SEC or Big Ten team.
Not even close.
And so I think everyone around the fan base knew that. Whether they said it publicly or not is kind of what you're kind of alluding to, which is like, okay, do we need someone who can kind of take us to the next level? And we come to find out now that John McNulty as the OC was definitely a step down from Versteeg and probably from Kirk Soraka, who ultimately replaced him in that role. And we saw that resurgence in 2009 with freshman Tom Savage, right? So there are things we didn't really know at the time, but there are things we did know at the time. And so I think that Schiano did such a great job of covering up or turning a weakness into a strength that it maybe have allowed that like adrenaline high to roll a little longer than it normally would have, but then it caused the crash to feel a little bit harder. But even then, his last year, they were, one game away from a co-Big Ten championship in 2011. So it's not like the bottom dropped out, but they were unable to defeat the really, really good teams outside of 2006, which was the pinnacle of that.
And even in 2006, we beat Louisville and then we go on and get a couple losses. So it's kind of, it stings. And I wonder, I think it might even be a silly question, but the personnel clearly had something to do with 2006 too. I mean, look at those. Ray Rice, if the nonsense hadn't happened, I mean, he's probably headed for a Hall of Fame NFL career. I mean, right. And so, some of these other guys, on the line on defense, I watched that when I rewatched that game and just some of the names, when I hadn't seen it. I think a few years ago I hadn't seen it since it happened, and I'm looking at it and I'm forgetting some of the guys. I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, him and him and him. That has something to do with it. And that speaks to recruiting, development. I mean, chicken or the egg again, right? I mean, did he get just the best, most talented players by luck, or did he help develop them? Probably.
Can I make a quick point on that real quick? Sorry to interrupt you, but basically that's true. But I think if you look at some of the teams a couple years later, they had more NFL talent. I mean that to me, that's, however, and this is where I want to tie it back, and we might talk about this in the next episode. But the guys who were the backbone, and you saw this with Pikel in basketball, the guys who were there, that were there from the beginning, they have a little bit of extra something inside. Part of it is the chip on the shoulder. Part of it is that you see the results. And I think that those guys in that 2006 team, and this is where I'm a little bit concerned about the next couple of years of Schiano now, is because the guys who are on these 2023, 2024 teams, they were there for this full rebuild. And there's something you can't replace with that, right? And that's where perhaps there was a little bit of, hey, I'm coming into a winning program. Whereas if you're Tyreen Powell, you're coming into a program it's just promises, right? Yeah. And you have to be the one who's the changer. You have to do it. Not, it's like if you see a piece of trash on the floor in your house or on your lawn, like, who's going to pick it up? If you don't pick it up, no one's going to pick it up, right? And so I think that part of it was that, where the guys who came in, I'm not saying they weren't talented players. I'm not saying they were good players, but they didn't have those experiences of basically like being a poorer team in college football from a, talent, exposure standpoint to being up there. And there's something you cannot recreate with that. And that's where I think even if the talent was even equal or slightly better a couple of years later with more NFL players, you can't, they're Q Frierson, DeVron Thompson, like, there might have been a more talented guy that came after him, but they were like the heart and soul of New Jersey, not just Rutgers in that moment.
That makes a lot of sense. So, but then you go to the 2012 season, and I believe that's the season where we lose to Louisville, and I'm at the game, and Teddy Bridgewater comes in on a bum ankle and winds up beating us. We get the fake, what was it? Fake field goal.
It was a fake field goal that got called back for an illegal man downfield, which really wasn't.
Yes, that was brutal, but
it would have been I think 21-3 at that moment. Yes, maybe even 21-0.
I think it was 3, right. But it was, we thought we were running away with it. But even before we get blown out, I think it was by UConn. Was it UConn or was it Pitt? I think, or Pitt.
The UConn blowout was in 2011 in the last game of the season, which I was unfortunately at.
So who'd we get? I don't want to recount everything if we don't know, but I thought we could have clinched the Big East, but we lose to some teams.
So 2012 was Schiano's, was actually Kyle Flood's first
Yeah,
year.
it was Flood. Yeah.
So Rutgers starts out 7-0. They lose because they have a zillion turnovers against Kent State, which
I was there.
ironically enough, had Schiano been coaching and he would have just ran the ball the whole game,
Yep.
we wouldn't have had Gary Nova throwing
Yep.
2 pick sixes, right?
Yep.
But then what you're remembering was that Louisville had, I think it was Louisville, had lost earlier in the day on the second to last week of the season.
Yeah.
And Rutgers was still undefeated in Big East play. And they were playing Pittsburgh, who had only like 1 conference win at that point. So Rutgers goes into Pittsburgh ranked, and all they need to do is beat Pittsburgh.
Yes.
To
outright win.
Then the Louisville game the following week wouldn't have even mattered.
Yes.
At all.
Yes.
And ultimately, it was a bizarre game. I think Juwan Jameson was already hurt at that point, and Rutgers basically it almost looked like they didn't try.
It was
like
bad.
It was so weird because it was almost as if they came into the game thinking, hey, this game doesn't matter because it's all going to be on next week anyway. But instead, if they would have just won that game, chop, 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 they wouldn't have even needed it. To their credit, they came out firing the following week. But again, that was actually Kyle Flood's first year, but he was really riding the coattails of the Schiano experience because it was all Schiano's players. The recruiting class, even the freshmen, had been put together by Schiano before he left. And so that was actually the first year of the Flood era in 2012.
Yeah, so I knew it was the Flood era there, and I got my UConn and Pitt mixed up because I guess I have just bad memories of both in that little era. But my point in that was, even in the 2012 season, which I know Schiano wasn't here, but it was still his team, his culture, his players. They only got a share of the Big East title.
Correct.
Missed out that year on the big, New Year's bowl game because Louisville beats us. And I guess what I'm asking is, he had assembled all these really good recruits right before he left. We had gotten there, and to your point about Kent State, maybe if he's here and he knows how to just go into a shell and run, we beat them. They're a less talented physically team. What was him leaving? So he's building this culture. It does, I guess you could say, plateau after 2006, although those of us, which is all of us, who lived through the Ash era and even, the Flood after that, which is another conversation for another day because I have a nuanced opinion on the Flood tenure. But was it going to continue? I mean, would we all just take perennial bowl contention, number one? Number two, the transition into the Big Ten. I don't know if people remember, our first year in the Big Ten, while we didn't do excellently in conference, we had a good year. We beat the hell out of UNC in Detroit to end that year, and that was Flood. That was not a bad, and obviously, props to the OC that year, but it wasn't a terrible transition initially. Then it was absolutely abysmal. But was there momentum that was stalled, is my question, because Schiano left, or because schematically teams had figured us out in a way, because we were going to make the transition that no matter how well we were doing with guys like Hamilton and these guys in Jersey that Schiano managed to pull right before he left, was the landscape changing so much going into the Big Ten that it wouldn't have mattered that much? I'm not saying we would have been Ash level bad, but right now where we are, that bridge, would we because we're back kind of to, we're not great in the Big Ten, but we're a respectable program. We're not abysmal. Would that ascension have put us in a much better place now? Or would all these other dynamics and conference realignment and everything kind of left us where we are now anyway, just given where Rutgers is in the overall football world? How much did that really change it? Was he going for something amazing, and was he going to hit it like some people like to say? Or was it maybe the right move that he left for a little bit, learn some more, make him better equipped for now because we were going to kind of stay there?
I mean, that's the $1 million, or I guess now probably $1 billion question when it comes to TV revenue, right? There's no way to truly know. But if I had to say, again, because it's a podcast and it's our job to speculate, right, even though we don't know, I think that it's entirely possible Rutgers could have gotten to a Wisconsin, Iowa type level if they would have just continued. Because the biggest thing, one of Schiano's biggest strengths is recruiting, right? Mm-hmm. And we've seen what he's been able to do just by selling the Big Ten. Yeah. So if he would have had, let's say he was still there in 2013 and their defensive backfield was complete trash. Now, maybe he wouldn't have let that happen. Maybe. Right. Because there are some things like that. because he did fix it in 2005 after they couldn't stop Arizona State, and then obviously they had the season in 2006. But you saw how, like you said, his recruits were the core of that 2014 team that did go 8-5. I think they were only 3-5 in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
But I think there is a world where I think it's entirely plausible that Rutgers would have been your Wisconsin, Iowa type Big Ten team rather than your Northwestern up and down one, right? But even if you're a Northwestern up and down one, I think that if that was true, I think worst case, we're still back to where we are. Worst case.
Yep.
Most likely case is you're kind of like a poor man's Iowa. You're not 8-4 every year, but you're 8-4, 7-5 most of the time, and then you have an occasional clunker now and then.
Yes.
The big question is, because I'm confident that with the recruiting, they would have been a top 7 maybe in the 14-team Big Ten conference in aggregate with recruiting. I firmly believe that. Where the rubber hits the road, though, is at what point would he have figured out that even if you're 7th in recruiting, the top 3 are in your division, right? Because divisions wouldn't have changed. You would have been playing Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State every single year. Do I think that Greg Schiano, if he stayed here the entire time, would have been 1-29 against those 3 teams? No. Do I think he would have been 10-20? No. Right?
Yeah,
so there's somewhere in there. But to your point, long term, it's probably better that he took his lumps and had some humbling experiences elsewhere that would make him better in the long run. And then, if based to your other point, had they stayed 7-5, would somebody have come up with a brilliant idea that, like, no, now we need the guy to put us over the top? And I do think there's a world where, let's say they're sputtering out 8-4, 9-3 even seasons. Picture like a 9-3 season where their only 3 losses are Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State. They end up in a New Year's Six bowl and they beat the crud out of like Auburn or something, who half their team isn't playing because they're going to the NFL or whatever. Like, we're on this high, and then the following year they go, I don't know, 6-6. Somebody gets hurt. There's entirely a scenario there where a divorce might have happened, an ugly divorce might have happened. Rutgers brings in a hot coach. They go with a high-powered passing attack, and then it just crashes down. Like, I do think there might have been a scenario where that would have happened inevitably anyway, and there might have been like one season better than 2006 that came, but we'd be in a worse position now if that happened, because whereas the most likely scenario is we'd just basically be right where we are now, and we'd basically be Iowa, like with Kirk Ferentz, where people get pissed off that they don't have an offense, but they do win games. You have enough talent. I think that's the most likely, but there is a scenario where it could be better, and there's a 1 in 1,000 shot that he would have learned these lessons, had a high-powered offense. You get a dual-threat quarterback. You do upset Penn State, or you get Michigan on the Brady Hoke year with Schiano as your coach. You still win that game. And 2014, you go, 10-2, 11-1, and you're in the New Year's Six. Like, it's possible, but I think the most likely outcome is what I said, that they would have kind of just been where we are now for like a longer period of time. And then as long as they didn't have one terrible season, there wouldn't have been an ugly divorce between Schiano and the fan base where people thought that they could do better.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I don't want to go too far into part 2, because I had a couple questions that kind of, I think, would launch us there. As far as the dual threats and what he learned and the ceiling, the true ceiling that we're going to get into in part 2. But how much, we talked a lot about the schematics and the recruiting and the on the field product, but how much of Schiano's success in his first tenure and success can have a wide definition in this question, and continued success, again, with a wide definition, not necessarily only on field results and wins and losses. How much of it was due to the culture building, branding? It seemed like fundraising and, like branding with the Block R's, going on the commercials with James Gandolfini, bringing New Jersey culture, intertwined into Rutgers. Even now, I mean, when I'm on YouTube watching completely unrelated content, I get commercials for the boardwalk and the game and Schiano speaking with the song, "Ooh, baby, baby," in the background. Like, it's constant. I mean, he's always branding in that first era. even before the success on the field that catapulted it, there was certainly this effort underway. And I knew from being around people who were being recruited at the time, having graduated high school in 03, there was a concerted effort to brand Rutgers, to intertwine Rutgers with the culture of New Jersey, with the tough guy Jersey image. You see it now. He comes back and you have the Sopranos theme, with a reshot, chopped up, intro on the big screen. It looks like Tony, driving to his house. It's a player driving to the stadium. How much of the success is branding and Jersey culture and the fact that he gets the culture? And with that success, primarily looking at the first era, but even kind of how we can kind of transition to part two, which is coming later, transitioning into now, how much of it even is dependent on wins and losses? I understand if you're under 500 every year, it's not going to do anything. But if you're hovering around a respectable team, either where we are now or if we could get to the level of an Iowa, Wisconsin. I know Wisconsin didn't have a great year last year, but you get my point.
Right.
How much of it is just that cultural branding, the fun, the identity, the pride, and how much does that matter to it? And how much does that sustain you, even if you're not transcending that last threshold and really being a perennial contender, which I have trouble believing Rutgers over B. We'll save that for part two.
Yeah.
But how much of that branding mattered in part one? How much of that transcended the on-the-field product? How much did it intertwine? And how much is that relevant to Rutgers overall as a football program that Schiano seemed to understand at an in-depth, intimate level?
I think that this is sort of a cop-out answer, I guess, in the sense it's a hybrid. And what I mean by that is this applies to life. So, I mean, I'm trying not to get into life lessons, right? But it's basically like if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. I think that's a slight overstatement. Really what you're trying to do, and any person who does really, really well in life will tell you the same thing, is you put as many of your hats in that ring and right, it's like the lottery. You put one ticket, you could win. You could. But really what you want to put as many irons in the fire as you can. I don't think the culture matters if you don't win. But what it does allow you to do is it allows you to hover if needed. Because a lot of times you'll say, or people who play Madden, then they're like, if you're not going forward, you're going backward. Is one of the quotes. I forget what it was, like Madden 04 or whatever. They would say it was like the same stuff. And I think that's true, that if you're not moving forward, you're moving backward. But if you have the culture, if you have the branding, if you have that, there is a kind of delay. Like those of us who watch the games religiously, we're making hot takes all over the place.
Of course.
But like your fair weather fan uncle who graduated and isn't a fan or something like that.
Yep.
It's like a little bit of a delay. So you can kind of like shrink the impact.
Yeah.
Whereas, and I think it does matter. The other thing is like people don't notice you did all these small things, but if you then achieve success, then and you have this in place, then it's easier to sustain it. And it's also a better foundation in case something goes wrong. I mean, I know the cliche for the house foundation's overused, but that is true. That you can just put up a house in a month and it doesn't, or even a week, even I guess, and it might look good, it might be fine, but that isn't going to survive the test of time because eventually something will happen and it will shatter. It will shake that foundation. So if you have the culture, if you have the branding, if you have all these things, I don't think it necessarily makes you better in that moment, but it allows you to weather the storm when that happens. And then I do think it was a pretty big factor in retrospect. But if Chris Ash did that, I don't think it would have mattered.
That makes sense. And I would say, to piggyback off some of your points, do you think that kind of in a duality type way of looking at it, that after 2006, because A, the culture and branding was in place, that it catapulted, and B, that it allowed it to kind of sustain itself and hover, even though there wasn't really, we didn't ever attain success, in excess of 2006 or even match it, but the general vibes and, even if you look at ticket sales and you look at the
Right.
perception of Rutgers and that, that era after the next 6-7 years after 2006, that, based on your point, was part of the reason it was able to sustain that branding, that culture after that success, and then kind of hover, but it gets stale if you don't win. And it certainly gets stale if you swap out the whole staff and you change the culture and tear it down too. But maybe Rutgers needed. Let me ask you this, because you already said, maybe it was better that Schiano got out and got other experiences, and to kind of tee us up for part two. Let me ask you this. Do you think that the tearing down of that branding and culture to some level, well, there's still remnants, right? The block R's, the fan bases that the growth of the fan base, the fans that came on board in 06 that are still with us, which is a lot. Was it necessary? And I don't want to, it's terrible when you go to such lows as we've been, but to rejuvenate that branding and rejuvenate and better align it for today's football world and the new conference, was it inevitable or necessary for that culture to kind of be ripped down completely when Ash came in, as opposed to, say, Flood kind of hangs on by a string to it and still reaches depths on the field, but we have that little semblance of a culture? Schiano comes back, or was fully ripping it away, important for everybody to kind of value how important it was when he came back? And that'll tee us up for part two if you answer that question.
I don't think so. I don't, because in college football, there's no, let me say it this way. If you're a big-time blue blood program, yes, the Brady Hoke experience at Michigan did allow everyone to really get themselves humbled for a minute there, for a program that's basically, I think they got the most wins in the history of college football, right? For them to lose to Rutgers, even though it was like a best Rutgers team in a while, the worst Michigan team, comes down to a blocked field goal at the end, but it's in a binary scenario, they lost that game. I think for a program like that, to reach an all-time low, or maybe you've seen this like at UCLA in basketball, yes. But for anybody else, no. I think that every dollar that you lose, you don't recoup. It doesn't work like that. It's not like, well, I didn't donate 10,000 last year, so I'm going to take all that and the new one and do it this year. I don't think it works like that. So for anyone who's in the middle of the Power 5, now Power 4, even a lower Power 4 team, no, I don't think that works. I think it would have been better to just keep riding the way that it was. To be honest, to answer your question.
That makes sense. And just an anecdote for people out there who listen, sometimes you get personal stories. The Michigan game 2014, it was my second to last year. It was my last year of law school. I went there with my girlfriend at the time, my sister, her friend, and a bunch of other buddies. We tailgated. It was an epic tailgate because it was a night game. We were all hyped, and we wanted retribution for the Penn State loss early in the year, which was awesome. We're drinking, but I'm maintaining because I'm like, I got to see this game. My sister and her friend and my girlfriend, they drink so much, they're just like, oh, I'm going. They're like hanging out in the parking lot. They don't want to come into the game. They fall. One or two of them falls asleep in the car. And we're watching, my buddy and I are watching this epic game. Obviously, Teray blocks the field goal. We're going crazy. I got a picture when I'm on the field because we went on the field, the blackout game, whatever. Years go by. I'm like, I'm telling my sister, you missed a hell of a game. Years go by. And Gary Nova comes on the night report, like the Rivals Rutgers football board for some reason, and he's answering questions. And somebody says, oh, do you think your best game was like Arkansas? I forget which Arkansas game.
Yeah.
And Gary just goes, actually, and he's dead serious. He's like, I think Michigan 2014 was my best game, my favorite game ever. And I screenshotted that and sent it to my sister. Like, see, even Nova says you missed his best game of his career. What are you doing?
I threw for, I think, 404 yards in that game. And they had no run game.
No, I mean, he was throwing the ball all over the place that game. It was I remember Brady Hoke at the end, if you watch the highlights, even he's just going up to Nova like hell of a game. I mean, so anyway, that was one of it. You had good Gary and bad Gary, and that's a whole nother conversation too. But David, tell the people where they could find you and give a little preview, because I know we're going to do part 2 of Embracing the Future of College Athletics probably next, and we're going to do the true ceiling of Schiano and Rutgers football. We're going to take this conversation into part 2. Tell the people where they could find you, if you got any appearances coming up on any other channels, and what they can expect from the content we have coming up.
Well, I've been a little bit slow with my content on Off Tackle Empire, to be honest. You can find me on Are You Ready for Brazil on there. That's my handle. We use handles there, whereas Aaron used to always encourage us, even though it's also Vox Media, Aaron encouraged us to use our real names because we were trying to be very like journalistically improper at that time. Off Tackle Empire is a complete reverse. So you can find me there, or if you want to buy a house in North or South Carolina or Florida, you can look me up that way. That's obviously where I spend more of my time. But yeah, I mean, in terms of where the Rutgers ceiling is, I think we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk a little bit about, we have the data point of that 2010 season that Rutgers was able to recover from under Schiano. So we do have some evidence we didn't talk about in this one when we talk about where we think Rutgers is going, evolving the sport, things like that. And then also for part 2 of the embracing the future of college football, we're going to talk a little bit more about it from a player standpoint. Now, I didn't play high level college football, obviously, so I can't talk about what it's like to get paid or that type of thing. But we're going to talk, part 2 is going to be a little bit more from the player's mindset, right? We talked a lot about from the general manager. As a player now, if you can be cut and they're not going to honor your 4-year scholarship, that's going to impact your decision making some, obviously. Maybe, if you had a shot at playing professionally, but you're guaranteed to take that paycheck to stay in college for next year, that's a completely different calculus. And so that's kind of where we're going to go with part 2 of that one before ultimately we really kind of talk a little bit more about on-field stuff. I think that might be more of a part 3, but that's my primer for the next 2 parts of each mini series.
Yeah, and I'm excited about it. Make sure you guys tune in. The first episode obviously did really well. Hopefully you guys like this one as well. And I hope we teed up a good transition because, the Schiano 1.0 era, we are well familiar with it, but we got into the weeds a little bit. And what can we glean from the end of that to catapult us into what happened when Schiano took over in 2019 this time around? And, those schematics we talked about, the recruiting is different as far as, developing guys and having guys ready schematically and, in a new world of recruiting and pay for play and other teams that we're going up against who have really deep resources and deep pockets. What is our actual ceiling, and should we be content with it? Should we be upset, et cetera, et cetera? That's all coming to you. So make sure you keep it locked right here to Night Watch. That'll be out in a week or 2, and be on the lookout for it. Hope everybody's enjoying the pleasant weather and had a happy Easter and is out there embracing the new season. Football's coming. Make sure you attend the spring game. Larry K and David Anderson are out.